You already know the story, or you think you do. Genesis 14 gives you a figure named Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, who appears in 4 verses, blesses the patriarch Abraham, receives 1/10 of the spoils of war, and disappears. No origin, no death, no explanation. Scholars have puzzled over him for centuries. The book of Hebrews built a substantial theological argument on his mysterious qualities. But the baseline assumption is almost universal. Melchizedek is strange, yes. Unexplained, yes. But ultimately human. A man without a recorded genealogy. A priest without a traceable lineage, a mystery in the natural register. The kind of mystery that implies a missing document rather than a missing category. In 1956, in Cave 11 above the Dead Sea, at a site called Qumran, archaeologists recovered a fragmentary scroll, later designated 11Q Melchizedek. The scroll was written in the 1st century BC, perhaps the 2nd. It does not treat Melchizedek as a mysterious human priest. It treats him as a heavenly figure, a divine agent, an entity who will execute the final judgment of God, preside over the cosmic day of atonement, liberate the sons of light from the dominion of Belial, and atone for the sins of the righteous. And when the scroll applies a title to Melchizedek, it uses the word Elohim, drawn from Psalm 82, a term that can name the God of Israel, but can also mark members of the divine realm. Not merely human, not merely genealogically obscure, an Elohim figure, placed inside Psalm 82's divine council language, applied to Melchizedek, by a community that studied the Hebrew texts with the same rigor as any tradition that followed them. By the end of this video, you will understand how 1 Second Temple Jewish text understood Melchizedek, and why that reading transforms the mystery Genesis 14 leaves behind. You will understand what 11Q Melchizedek says in specific cited detail, the role it assigns him, the divine titles it applies, his relationship to the Day of Atonement, and the eschatological framework in which he operates. You will understand how the scroll positions Melchizedek and Belial as structural counterparts, the heavenly agent of atonement against the prince of darkness, and why that structure transforms how the scapegoat ritual, this channel examined in a previous episode, must be read. And you will understand why this scroll is among the most theologically disruptive texts found at Qumran, and why its implications have remained invisible to the mainstream traditions that have been reading Genesis 14 as a human mystery ever since. The book of Hebrews builds one of the most sustained theological arguments in the New Testament on this figure, arguing that Christ is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, superior to the Levitical priesthood, eternal, unchanging, a high priest whose office is not contingent on descent or mortal succession. The argument depends entirely on Melchizedek's mysterious qualities, his lack of genealogy, his lack of recorded beginning and end. What 11Q Melchizedek reveals is that before or around the emergence of early Christianity, at least one Jewish interpretive stream had already imagined Melchizedek as a heavenly figure with a cosmic role in judgment. Not merely a mysterious human priest, but a named agent of the divine court. The Hebrews' argument and the Qumran account are not contradictions. They are convergences arriving from different directions at the same transhuman figure. And the tradition that read one and lost the other has been reading Genesis 14. Without the most radical answer, the tradition itself had already produced. The 11Q Melchizedek scroll assigns Melchizedek a specific date for his cosmic intervention. Not a vague eschatological horizon. The scroll places it inside a precise Jubilee scheme, the 10th Jubilee. 11Q. Melchizedek is a fragmentary Dead Sea Scroll that applies divine titles to Melchizedek and positions him as a heavenly agent of judgment, atonement, and liberation at the end of history. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what the scroll claims. In cited detail from its surviving columns, and why those claims go far beyond a reading of Melchizedek as a mysterious but ultimately human priest. The scroll was recovered in 1956 from Cave 11 at Qumran, one of the later discoveries in the sequence that began with Cave 1 in 1947. It was designated 11Q13 in the standard Dead Sea Scrolls cataloging system. The surviving portions are primarily from columns 2 and 3, which contain its theologically densest material. It was published for the first time by the Dutch scholar A.S. van der Voorde in 1965, nearly a decade after its physical recovery, a gap that reflects the complexity of reconstructing fragmentary material and the slow, restricted publication process of the early Dead Sea Scrolls era. What van der Voorde published was not a narrative, it was a thematic midrash, an interpretive commentary that weaves together passages from multiple books of the Hebrew Bible into a unified eschatological argument centered on a single figure. The texts the scroll draws on are specific and deliberate. Leviticus 25:13. On the Jubilee year of release, Deuteronomy 15:2, on the remission of debts, Isaiah 52:7 and 61:1-2, on the herald who announces the year of the Lord's favor and the liberation of the captives, Psalm 7:8-9, on the divine assembly executing judgment, and Psalm 82:1-2, on the God who stands in the divine council and judges among the gods. The scroll does not cite these texts loosely. It cites them in sequence and applies each one to Melchizedek directly, assembling from the Hebrew Bible's own language a theology in which Melchizedek is the agent who will execute everything these texts collectively describe. The midrash form is important. This is not speculation or invention. It is a method of reading in which each cited text is made to illuminate the others, with Melchizedek as the interpretive key that unlocks the whole. The core claim of the scroll is stated in column 2. Melchizedek will carry out the vengeance of God's judgments. He will deliver the sons of light from the hand of Belial and the spirits of his lot. He will atone for the iniquities of all the sons of his lot. Priestly language, the language of Yom Kippur, applied not to an earthly priest performing the Leviticus 16 ritual, but to a heavenly being performing its cosmic original. Column 2. The scroll is specific. Melchizedek will execute the judgment of God. He will atone for the sons of light. He will judge the lot of Belial. The scroll applies to him the word Elohim, drawn from Psalm 82:1, not merely human, not merely genealogically obscure, an Elohim figure, placed by the scroll inside Psalm 82's divine council language, in a text found in the same caves as the book of Isaiah 2,000 years ago, written by people who believed this was imminent. The Psalm 82 application is not incidental. Psalm 82 verse 1 reads, "God stands in the divine assembly. In the midst of the gods, he judges." The scroll cites this verse and identifies the figure performing the judgment. The Elohim standing in the assembly as Melchizedek. Elohim is a term that can name the God of Israel, but can also mark members of the divine realm. God's heavenly beings, figures operating within the divine council. Psalm 82 itself deploys it in exactly that divine council setting, where it designates not only the presiding God, but the beings being judged. In 11q Melchizedek, that term is applied to Melchizedek in the context of Psalm 82's heavenly court, positioning him not as a subordinate attendant, but as the figure exercising the presiding authority the psalm assigns to the divine judge. John Collins, in The Scepter and the Star, notes that this application of Psalm 82 to a named mediator figure is one of the most striking features of the Qumran Melchizedek theology. The Isaiah 61 connection extends the argument. The scroll cites Isaiah 61:2, the year of the Lord's favor, the year of release, and identifies this as the year of Melchizedek's cosmic intervention. The Jubilee legislation of Leviticus 25, in which the year of release means the liberation of the enslaved and the return of ancestral property, is reread by the scroll as describing Melchizedek's liberation of the sons of light from Belial's dominion. The captives being freed are not agricultural debtors in 8th century Judah. They are the righteous held under the spiritual authority of the Prince of Darkness. The figure carrying out the liberation is the heavenly high priest, Isaiah's herald, who announces the year of the Lord's favor, is reread as announcing Melchizedek's cosmic intervention. The scroll does not quote these texts and then comment on them. It fuses them into a single coherent statement about a single coherent figure. The atonement function assigned to Melchizedek in column 2 is among the scroll's most theologically precise claims. The Hebrew root KPR, to atone, to cover, is central to the language of the Day of Atonement and deeply associated with priestly ritual. The scroll assigns it to Melchizedek as a heavenly act, performed on behalf of the sons of light in the cosmic version of the ritual that Leviticus 16 prescribes for the earthly temple. Florentino Garcia Martinez, in the Dead Sea Scrolls Translated, renders the relevant column 2 passage as Melchizedek, performing atonement for all the sons of light. This is not a loose decorative metaphor. In the Second Temple framework, KPR is a specific priestly function with specific liturgical context. Assigning it to Melchizedek is assigning him a priestly office in the heavenly court, an office that has no earthly counterpart except the Levitical high priest on Yom Kippur, whose earthly performance the scroll presents as the shadow of Melchizedek's heavenly act. What the scroll does not do is explain how Melchizedek acquired this role, where he came from, or how the divine being of the scroll relates to the priest-king of Genesis 14. The connection is assumed, not argued. The Qumran community apparently found it self-evident that the Melchizedek of 11Q Melchizedek was the same figure as the Melchizedek who blessed Abraham. Or more precisely, that Genesis 14's mysterious qualities were consistent with, and perhaps pointed toward, the cosmic being the scroll describes without the genealogical constraint of human narrative. A future episode will examine Psalm 82 and the divine council theology more fully. The assembly in which divine beings are judged, in which God addresses the gods and declares they will die like men. It is among the most compressed and theologically startling passages in the Hebrew Bible. The Qumran reading of it through Melchizedek is only one thread in a tradition that runs through Deuteronomy 32, 1 Kings 22, and into the New Testament itself. The scroll specifies when Melchizedek's cosmic intervention will occur. The 10th Jubilee, a calculated date in the Qumran eschatological framework. The calculation has not been addressed yet. Hold it. The scroll presents Melchizedek as a heavenly agent with a cosmic role in the final judgment. A claim so textually grounded, so specifically argued from the Hebrew Bible's own vocabulary, that it cannot be dismissed as casual embellishment. But the tradition that inherited Genesis 14 already had a theological framework for understanding Melchizedek. One constructed without access to this scroll that drew on the same mysterious qualities the scroll elevates to the cosmic register. And that became so dominant in Christian theology that the scroll's implications have never been incorporated into the tradition they most directly concern. The book of Hebrews builds a sustained theological argument on Melchizedek's lack of genealogy and recorded death, treating these silences as typological pointers toward Christ's eternal priesthood. By the end of this chapter, you will understand why that argument is theologically serious, exactly where it stops, and what 11Q Melchizedek reveals that Hebrews does not address. Before establishing the limits of the Hebrews framework, the framework itself deserves its due. The author of Hebrews was not misreading Genesis 14. The observation is accurate and carefully made. Melchizedek appears without genealogy, without recorded parentage, without a beginning of days in the narrative, without a recorded death. He receives a tithe from Abraham, the ancestor of Levi, the ancestor of the Levitical priests. If Abraham, the Levitical priesthood's patriarch, rendered tribute to Melchizedek, then by the logic of Hebrews 7, the Levitical order has already acknowledged its subordination to the order of Melchizedek through the act of its ancestor. The argument is careful. It is internally consistent. It requires no external source beyond the Genesis text itself. The typology, that Melchizedek's eternal, genealogy-free, death-free presentation prefigures Christ's eternal priesthood, is not an imposition on Genesis 14. It is a reading that follows from the text's own deliberate structure. Early Christian theologians, who saw in Melchizedek a foreshadowing of Christ, were not inventing connections from nothing. They were following the logic of the text as the text presents it, using the tools of typological interpretation that were standard in their exegetical tradition. Hebrews 7:3 states the argument directly. Melchizedek is without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. The phrase resembling the Son of God is the key to the entire Hebrews framework. Melchizedek is not the Son of God in this argument. He resembles him. His mysterious qualities function typologically. They point toward something. They are the hermeneutical lever by which the author of Hebrews argues for Christ's superior, eternal priesthood. The Hebrews argument is about what Melchizedek points toward, and the argument is legitimate on its own terms. This is where the Hebrews framework ends and 11q Melchizedek begins. The scroll asks a different question. Not only what does Melchizedek point toward, but what role can Melchizedek play in the heavenly order? In the theology of the Qumran community, a community that had studied the Hebrew texts with the same intensity and rigor as the author of Hebrews, but from within a Second Temple Jewish framework that preserved traditions the later canon did not retain, Melchizedek is not a human priest, whose mysterious qualities serve as a typological resource. He is a heavenly agent, a figure who occupies a specific office in the cosmic hierarchy, and is assigned a specific role in the final eschatological drama. Where Hebrews uses the mystery as a theological lever, the scroll names what it considers the mystery to contain. And what the scroll names? A heavenly being addressed in the language of divine council membership, appointed to the cosmic day of atonement, is far more radical than the typological argument Hebrews constructs. The convergence between these two readings is more significant than either tradition has registered. Both Hebrews and 11q Melchizedek arrive at a transhuman, eternal priestly figure at the center of the divine governance of history. Hebrews arrives there through typology, via the observation that Melchizedek's mysterious human qualities point towards something beyond the human. The scroll arrives there cosmologically, via the direct positioning of Melchizedek as a heavenly agent with a defined cosmic office. Neither text contradicts the other. Both are working with the same Genesis 14 material. Both find in it a figure who is not simply a historical priest. The difference is that the scroll names a cosmic role for Melchizedek within one Second Temple interpretive framework, while Hebrews uses the unanswered mystery as a theological lever pointing forward. Why the convergence was never registered by the tradition is explicable in historical terms. The Qumran community was destroyed by Roman forces around 68 AD. The scrolls were sealed in the caves. The patristic theologians who built Christian Melchizedek theology, Origen, Ambrose, Chrysostom, the commentators on Hebrews through the medieval period, had no access to 11q Melchizedek. The scroll was published in 1965. The theology of Hebrews had been fixed for 19 centuries before the scroll's implications were available. When the Dead Sea Scrolls began to circulate in scholarly analysis after 1947, the theological establishment's reading of Hebrews had crystallized so thoroughly that the convergence was registered in the academic literature, but never incorporated into doctrinal or liturgical practice. Hebrews and 11q Melchizedek converge on the same figure from different angles. one using his mysterious human qualities as a typological resource, the other naming a cosmic role for him within the heavenly order. The convergence has been invisible to the tradition that reads Hebrews because the scroll was sealed in a cave for 2,000 years. But the scroll does not merely position Melchizedek in the heavenly court. It assigns him a specific moment, a calculated date, the 10th Jubilee. A precise scheme the scroll derives from Leviticus, Daniel, and the prophetic books. The date changes everything about how the scroll must be read. 11Q Melchizedek places Melchizedek's cosmic intervention in the 10th Jubilee, a specific eschatological time frame calculated from the Jubilee system of Leviticus 25. By the end of this chapter, you will understand how the Qumran community calculated that date, why they believed it was imminent in their own generation, and what their urgency reveals about the nature of the text they produced. This is the date named at the opening, the 10th Jubilee. We are here. The Jubilee system in Leviticus 25 operates on a precise numerical structure. Every 7th year is a sabbatical year, a year of rest for the land and remission of debts between Israelites. Every 7th sabbatical year is the 49th year, and the year following it, the 50th, is the Jubilee, the year of universal release, in which slaves are freed, debts canceled, and ancestral land returned to its original families. The Jubilee is not merely an agricultural or social institution in Leviticus. It is a cosmic reset, a return to the original distribution, a restoration of the order that existed before debt and displacement accumulated. 10 Jubilee cycles span 490 years. 11Q Melchizedek opens column 2 with a direct citation of Leviticus 25:13. In this year of Jubilee, you shall return, each of you, to your property. And immediately reinterprets it. The property being returned is not land. The captives being freed are not agricultural slaves. The liberation is cosmic. The sons of light, held under the dominion of Belial, and the spirits of his lot, will be freed in the year of Melchizedek's intervention. The Jubilee framework is the interpretive lens through which the entire cosmic drama is understood. The specific Jubilee in which this will occur is the 10th. The correspondence with Daniel 9:24-27 is not incidental. Daniel's vision of 70 weeks of years, 70 multiplied by 7, equaling 490 years, uses an identical numerical framework. Both 11Q Melchizedek and Daniel 9 are operating within the same tradition of eschatological calculation, in which the sabbatical year and Jubilee cycles are applied to cosmic rather than agricultural timescales. Paul Kobelski, in Melchizedek and Melchiresa, documents the correspondence in detail, noting that the 490-year framework functions in both texts as the total duration of the present cosmic order before divine intervention resets it. The Qumran community was not inventing a new calculation. It was applying a calculation framework present in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, and identifying within that framework the precise moment of Melchizedek's intervention. The urgency of the scroll must be understood against this background. A text that places Melchizedek's intervention within a named Jubilee framework is not a theoretical eschatology composed for posterity. The The text reads, like the product of a community for whom this intervention was not remote, but imminent. People reading the calculations and finding them converging on their own moment. The cosmic day of atonement, the liberation of the sons of light, the defeat of Belial's dominion, the judgment executed by the heavenly priestly agent. These were not distant prophecies in the scroll's framing. They were the near future, placed inside a scheme precise enough to feel urgent rather than abstract. The Day of Atonement element is essential to understanding the scroll's structure. Column 2 of 11, Q Melchizedek specifies Melchizedek's intervention in relation to the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, within the 10th Jubilee framework. The Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16 is the single day in the year on which the scapegoat ritual is performed. The high priest enters the Holy of Holies. 2 goats are brought forward, 1 sacrificed, and 1 sent to Azazel. The scroll's framing invites a reading in which Melchizedek performs, in the heavenly court, a version of the act the earthly high priest performs in the temple. Atonement, liberation, the separation of the righteous from the condemned. Whether that parallel is stated as a formula or implied by the scroll's architecture is a question scholars continue to debate. What is clear from column 2 is that the Day of Atonement, the Jubilee liberation of captives, and Melchizedek's act of heavenly atonement are woven together into a single eschatological event. What these 3 chapters have now assembled is not a commentary on an obscure scroll fragment. It is the evidence base for a single specific claim. At least one Qumran community understood the entire cosmic architecture of good and evil. The adversarial office, the Day of Atonement ritual, the judgment of the sons of darkness, as having a named heavenly presider whose role the scroll names directly. The second half of this video asks what that disclosure means, for how Hebrews reads Melchizedek, for how the scapegoat ritual must be understood once its heavenly structural counterpart is named, and for the broader tradition that has been reading Genesis 14 as a human mystery when the Dead Sea Scrolls had preserved a far more radical answer. Melchizedek's cosmic intervention is dated, imminent in the Qumran community's reckoning, and assigned to the Day of Atonement. The same ritual this series examined from the earthly side in its episode on the scapegoat. But the scroll does not only describe what Melchizedek will do, it describes what he will do it against and the identity of his cosmic opponent. Named in the scroll, present in the war scroll, present in the community rule, is the figure this channel's audience already knows. The heavenly high priest and the prince of darkness are structural counterparts. That structure transforms how everything in the scapegoat episode must now be read. 11Q, Melchizedek names. Belial as Melchizedek's structural opponent. The Prince of Darkness set against the heavenly agent of atonement. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the full architecture the scroll implies, how it connects to the scapegoat ritual this series has already covered, and why this counterpart structure represents one of the most concentrated accounts of priestly, judicial, and adversarial drama in the Second Temple tradition. 1 goat for God, 1 goat for Azazel. The scapegoat ritual has 2 recipients. A related architecture appears in the heavenly register, Melchizedek and Belial. the heavenly agent of atonement, and the prince of darkness, earthly atonement below, heavenly judgment above. The scroll names both sides. Column 2 of 11. Q. Melchizedek refers explicitly to the spirits of Belial's lot, the forces under Belial's command, who hold the sons of light in captivity. Melchizedek's intervention will liberate the sons of light from this dominion. The liberation is the cosmic Yom Kippur, the heavenly act of which the earthly ceremony in Leviticus 16 is the annual reenactment. Belial is not an incidental figure in the scroll's argument. He is the structural opposite of Melchizedek, the entity whose dominion the heavenly high priest is appointed to break, the cosmic adversarial pole against which the heavenly priestly office is defined. The structural parallel to the scapegoat ritual is the most suggestive connection the scroll enables. In Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement ritual addresses two figures simultaneously: the sacrifice to God and the goat sent to Azazel. The ritual is a dual address. It does not merely approach the divine, but explicitly names and dispatches the adversarial figure who receives the burden of Israel's sins. This channel's episode on the scapegoat ritual examined the earthly side of this structure in detail. The parallel is not stated as a formula in 11Q Melchizedek, but the architecture is hard to miss. Earthly atonement separates Israel from sin. The scroll imagines a heavenly act of release and judgment, with Melchizedek liberating the righteous from Belial's lot. The parallel may be structural rather than identity. Belial is not called Azazel in the scroll. But the alignment of heavenly and earthly atonement, each with a named adversarial figure receiving condemnation, maps closely enough to demand attention. Belial, as the Qumran community's primary adversarial figure, is established ground from a previous episode in this series, the Dead Sea Scrolls Community Rule, and its systematic presentation of Belial as the Angel of Darkness, the figure who holds the sons of darkness under his spiritual authority. 11Q. Melchizedek does not re-establish Belial's identity. It presupposes it and positions Melchizedek as his specific cosmic counterpart. The heavenly architecture is completed by the pairing, not merely an adversarial figure standing alone, but a pair, two poles of the cosmic moral order defined against each other. The War Scroll 1QM describes the final eschatological war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The sons of darkness are led by Belial. The sons of light are led by the archangel Michael. 11Q Melchizedek describes the same drama from a different angle, not the military narrative of the final battle, but the priestly narrative of the final judgment. Melchizedek is not the commander of the cosmic armies in the scroll's framing. He is the presider over the cosmic court. The one who executes the sentence after the battle decides its outcome. Both texts describe the same event from different registers. The War Scroll gives it a military frame. 11Q Melchizedek gives it a priestly frame. And both registers were active simultaneously in the Qumran community's theology. What this counterpart structure means for the tradition that inherited Genesis 14 without 11Q Melchizedek is not difficult to specify. That tradition inherited the earthly half of the cosmic architecture. It retained the scapegoat ritual's annual reenactment of the dual address. It retained the figure of the adversary, Belial in the scrolls, Satan in the later tradition, as the cosmic opponent of the divine order, but the heavenly side of the counterpart structure. The divine Redeemer figure who presides over the final atonement, who executes the judgment, who liberates the sons of light, was present in the tradition only in the form of the Genesis 14 mystery. A priest without genealogy, without origin, without death, whose cosmic role the narrative preserved without naming. The early church's focus on Christ as the singular agent of atonement made the dual recipient structure of the scapegoat ritual theologically difficult to maintain. As this series established in the scapegoat ritual episode, the heavenly counterpart structure was suppressed alongside the earthly one. Melchizedek was retained as a type of Christ's eternal priesthood, but the cosmic architecture in which he was the divine counterpart of Belial, in which the heavenly high priest and the prince of darkness were the two poles of the final cosmic drama, was lost with the Enochic tradition and the Qumran community that preserved it. What remained was the type. What was lost was the being the type was pointing toward. One of the most concentrated accounts of priestly, judicial, and adversarial drama in the Second Temple tradition. A heavenly agent and a named cosmic adversary, an atonement scheme and a calculated date, an architecture that gives the earthly scapegoat ritual a heavenly dimension the ritual does not supply on its own. But this architecture was not preserved in the canon, and the specific reason it was not preserved, the specific historical moment at which the Qumran tradition's theology became unavailable, is traceable, datable, and more recent than most readers of Genesis 14 realize. The 11Q Melchizedek scroll was not suppressed by a council or a decree. It was sealed in a cave by a community about to be destroyed. And the destruction is the reason the tradition it encoded did not survive to transmit it. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the historical moment at which the Qumran theology became unavailable, and what that unavailability cost both the Jewish and Christian traditions that inherited the texts without the community that understood them. This is the point where the story stops being about what the scroll says and becomes about why almost nobody inherited it. The Qumran settlement's destruction is datable to approximately 68 AD. The First Jewish-Roman War began in 66 AD. Roman military operations in the Jordan Valley proceeded in the campaign that culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple in 70 AD. The Qumran community, a sectarian Jewish group likely associated with or closely related to the Essenes, who had withdrawn from the mainstream temple establishment and built their own settlement in the desert, appears to have hidden their library in the surrounding caves before the Roman advance. The scrolls were wrapped, placed in ceramic jars, and sealed in multiple caves. The community did not return. The jars remained for approximately 19 centuries. What was lost was not merely the physical scrolls. Those survived, and their survival is among the most remarkable archival accidents in the history of religion. What was lost was the interpretive tradition, the living chain of scholars who had studied these texts, who knew which passages to read together, who held the theological framework that made 11Q Melchizedek legible in relation to the Jubilee calculations of Leviticus, the eschatological arithmetic of Daniel 9, the War Scrolls military eschatology, the community rules demonology, and the Psalm 82 divine council theology simultaneously. That chain was broken. The scrolls survived as objects. The tradition that could read them as a coherent theological system did not. This is the distinction that matters most in understanding why the scrolls' discovery in 1947 to 1956 did not transform the theological landscape in the way their content warranted. The objects came back. The living understanding did not. The gap between scholarly publication and theological consequence is not primarily a failure of scholarship. Paul Kobelski's Melchizedek and Melchiresa, published in 1981, remains the most sustained treatment of the scroll and its eschatological framework. Annette Yoshiko Reed's work on angel traditions in Second Temple Judaism, and John Collins's The Scepter and the Star have placed the Qumran Melchizedek theology in the broader context of divine mediator figures in Second Temple literature. The academic literature is substantial and has been growing for 50 years. The gap is institutional, not scholarly. The canonical framework of both Judaism and Christianity was fixed before the scrolls were discovered. The reading of Hebrews as the authoritative New Testament account of Melchizedek had been standard for nearly 20 centuries before 11Q Melchizedek was published. Incorporating the scroll's implications would require not merely adding a new source to the bibliography, but revising the theological architecture that 2 millennia of reading had produced. The kind of revision that religious institutions do not undertake in the absence of institutional crisis, conciliar decision, or the sustained pressure of a competing tradition with institutional weight. None of those conditions have been met. The academic literature exists. The theological consequence has not followed. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is a partial exception worth noting. Not because it preserved 11Q Melchizedek, but because it preserved parts of the wider Second Temple world that Western Christianity largely lost. The Ethiopian canon retained First Enoch and Jubilees, both of which keep alive a more populated heavenly cosmos, named angels, heavenly journeys, cosmic judgment, and structured angelic offices. That does not mean Ethiopian tradition preserves the Qumran Melchizedek scroll or a direct line from Qumran theology. It means it preserves adjacent material from the same wider world of thought. A Second Temple theological complex in which divine mediator figures, cosmic hierarchies, and named heavenly agents were not fringe speculation, but central architecture. The tradition that retained Enoch retained the world in which 11Q Melchizedek makes immediate sense. The tradition that excised Enoch inherited the texts without the framework. A figure worth a future episode in this connection. Samael, the angel of death, the accuser in certain strands of the rabbinic tradition, a divine being whose role in Jewish angelology is proximate to and yet distinct from the Belial and Satan traditions this series has examined. The suppression of Samael's theological complexity follows a pattern by now familiar to this channel's audience. The scroll was sealed by destruction, not by decision. And the tradition it encoded became unavailable, not because it was refuted, but because the community that held it was erased. Which leaves the final question. What does Genesis 14 look like when read alongside 11, Q Melchizedek? What does the 4-verse appearance of the priest-king of Salem mean when the reader knows that at least one community that had studied Genesis for generations understood that appearance through a theological framework in which Melchizedek was no ordinary human priest? Genesis 14:18-20 gives Melchizedek 4 verses, read without 11q, Melchizedek. Those verses are a mystery with no resolution in view. Read alongside it. The mystery acquires a shape, not a solution, but a context. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what the scroll's theology does to the Genesis text, not by resolving its silences, but by disclosing one serious Second Temple framework in which those silences made complete sense. Genesis 14:18-20 read plainly, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. He blessed Abram and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. 4 verses. A priest-king appears, performs 2 functions, blessing and receiving the tithe, and is not seen again in the narrative of Genesis. No prior scene establishes him. No subsequent scene follows from him. What the text does not say is as structurally precise as what it does. No origin, no genealogy, no prior history in the Abraham narrative, or in any prior section of Genesis. No recorded death, no explanation of how a priest of God Most High exists in Canaan at the time of Abram's wanderings, already established in a royal city called Salem, already performing a priestly office whose authority Abram acknowledges with 1/10. The silences are not accidental. The Genesis text does not appear to have lost anything in transmission. The silences are present in the text as silences. The narrative is complete. It has simply withheld what it withheld. 11q. Melchizedek does not fill these silences in the way a historical reconstruction might. It discloses one framework in which the silences make sense, as silences rather than as gaps. In the Qumran reading, the being who appears in Genesis 14 is a heavenly figure, a member of the divine court, operating in the register that Psalm 82's council theology describes. If that reading is applied to Genesis 14, then the absence of genealogy, parentage, origin, and death is not a narrative lacuna. It is a description consistent with that identity. The Genesis text preserves the appearance of a figure whose role the scroll names. Whether Genesis intended that reading is a separate question that the text itself does not answer. The title El Elyon, God Most High, is worth examining here. In Genesis 14, Melchizedek uses it first. Then Abram uses it, explicitly identifying it with YHWH. The ancient divine title El Elyon was, in the Canaanite context, associated with the head of the divine council, the presiding deity of the assembly of gods. The Psalm 82 divine council theology that 11Q Melchizedek draws on connects directly to this tradition. The divine assembly in which God stands and judges the gods is the assembly presided over by the Most High. Melchizedek's identification as priest of El Elyon in Genesis 14 is consistent with the scroll's theology at every point. The Genesis text does not contradict the scroll's account of Melchizedek. It is compatible with it. Compatible not through interpretive gymnastics, but through the straightforward observation that the title the Genesis text assigns to Melchizedek's priestly patron is the title most closely associated in the broader Semitic tradition with the divine council in which the scroll places him. What changes when both texts are read together is the reader's orientation to the Genesis text's silences. In the Qumran framework, the mysterious priest is not merely a type pointing forward, but a cosmic agent whose earthly appearance in the narrative of Abraham is consistent with a heavenly identity. The scroll names without apology. The Hebrews' argument that Melchizedek's mysterious qualities point toward an eternal priesthood, and the Qumran reading that those qualities reflect a heavenly being with a defined cosmic role, are not contradictions. They are different theological uses of the same textual mystery, arriving from different traditions, neither capable of fully accounting for the other. What does not change? The Genesis text still does not explain Melchizedek. 11Q. Melchizedek explains him in the Qumran community's theological framework. One framework among several serious ones available, neither text closes the question. Both together hold it with more precision than either alone. Genesis 14. A priest-king who appears without origin, blesses the patriarch, and vanishes. A figure whose deliberate silences the tradition has spent 2,000 years filling with typology, speculation, and unresolved theological argument. The Book of Hebrews, which used those silences as a typological resource, arguing that Melchizedek's lack of genealogy, beginning of days and end of life, points toward an eternal priesthood superior to the Levitical. A theologically serious argument, internally coherent, scripturally grounded, that explains what Melchizedek points toward without explaining what he is. 11Q Melchizedek, the Dead Sea Scroll that asks the question Genesis leaves open. A heavenly agent addressed in the language of Psalm 82's divine council, who will preside over the cosmic day of atonement within a precise Jubilee scheme, execute the final judgment, atone for the sons of light, and break the dominion of Belial, a text produced by a community for whom this intervention was not remote but close. The 10th Jubilee, not a vague eschatological horizon, but a calculated position within a framework shared with the 70 weeks of Daniel 9. The scroll's precision about the timing is not academic distance. It is the precision of a text written by people for whom the intervention felt imminent, not remote. The Melchizedek/Belial structure, the heavenly high priest and the prince of darkness, as the two poles of the cosmic moral order. The architecture that gives the scapegoat ritual its heavenly dimension. One goat for God, one for Azazel. And above that ritual, Melchizedek presiding over the judgment the ceremony enacts on earth. Belial standing in the heavenly register as the adversarial pole that judgment will finally break. What the tradition lost, not merely a curious scroll fragment, but the heavenly architecture that makes the earthly ritual legible. The cosmic counterpart to Belial, whose identity Genesis 14 concealed, and whose role the communities that produced the canon never recovered. A divine answer to a human mystery, sealed in a cave, preserved in fragments, and read by scholars who found it, had no path into the theology it most directly illuminates. Genesis 14 gives Melchizedek 4 verses. No origin, no death, no genealogy. A blessing, a tithe, a departure. The text is conspicuously, deliberately silent about everything that would make him comprehensible. The silence is not an accident of transmission. It is a literary choice. And the question that has occupied the tradition ever since is what that choice was concealing or preserving. The Hebrew's answer is that the silence points forward, toward a priesthood that is eternal, because its holder has no recorded beginning or end. The typology is real. It follows from the text's own logic. It is internally coherent, and the theological argument it enables is serious. The author of Hebrews was reading Genesis 14 correctly within the interpretive framework available. The silence points towards something. The argument holds on its own terms. The Qumran answer is different. In the theology of the community that produced 11 Q Melchizedek, the silence is not a forward pointer. It is a description consistent with a being who operates in the divine register. In the scroll's framework, Melchizedek is not mysterious because his human genealogy was lost in transmission. He is mysterious because he does not have one. He is a heavenly figure. Addressed in the language of Psalm 82's divine counsel, appointed to the cosmic day of atonement, positioned as the structural counterpart of Belial, whose role Genesis 14 preserves without naming, whose identity the text holds in silence not because the tradition forgot, but in this reading, because the tradition knew. Both answers are grounded in the same text. Both follow from it with rigor and internal consistency. Neither fully accounts for the other. The Hebrew's argument explains what Melchizedek's silence points toward, but not what it contains. The Qumran account names what the silence contains, but does not account for why the canonical tradition preserved the silence rather than the explanation, and the tradition that chose one and forgot the other, that fixed the typological reading and lost the cosmological one, that retained the mysterious human priest of Hebrews and sealed the divine heavenly judge of 11Q Melchizedek in a cave above the Dead Sea, has been reading Genesis 14 ever since as a human mystery, when one answer had been there all along, written in the 1st century BC, in a text the size of a handspan, in a cave above the water that was not found again for 2,000 years.